Yep. I am, in fact, neither. So my actual knowledge of wrestling is not very high. So that's why I have brought in a mark, I believe is the term. So Chris Eaton should be here shortly, hopefully. If not, we can. Yeah. There he is. Oh, right on time.
Professional. I got stuck in the elevator.
No worries. Well, it's right at 1 now, so we can go ahead and get started. So hey, welcome everybody. This is going to be a panel on Tokusatsu and wrestling. I am a big Tokusatsu fan, and sometimes I notice that you get these weird cross-promotion things, or with Godzilla vs. Kong, another thing is that director Adam Wingard said that he based Godzilla's personality in that movie off of a character called the Undertaker. And my knowledge of the Undertaker is he's the one with the hat. So I figured I need to turn to an expert here for wrestling insight if I'm going to talk to any extent about this fascinating kind of overlap in the genre.
How's it going, everyone? My name is Chris Eaton. I'm the co-host of the Kaiju Kingdom podcast. So we're going to nerd out about pro wrestling and kaiju, two of my loves in life.
So if you watch a lot of kaiju material or tokusatsu, you'll notice a lot of time they have fun with the whole idea that this is a big rubber suit wrestling match. And sometimes it's more explicit than not. Here are a couple of examples where it's very explicit within the text that they are kind of lampooning that. But other times the influences tend to be a little bit more kind of subtle. And this is an example that I have noticed, that if you look in the Showa series, the Heisei series, and the Millennium series, the way that they write verses changes over time. And the way that they changed it, if you look at that character that's in the yellow circles, reflects how wrestling matches were built over the decades. So in the 60s, it was with the Tai kanji. In the 90s, it was the BS, and then in the 2000s, it was changed to the X. So we're going to talk about some of the history of the professional wrestling industry in Japan, and how it has overlapped with Tokusatsu over time, how the two have influenced each other, and some of the titles that are specifically about wrestling and actors that have crossed over between the two. So much like Godzilla, professional wrestling in Japan took off in 1954. It was an import from the US, and really the story behind this was there was a Korean dude named Riki Dozan. He was wrestling in California right after the war, right?
Right after the war. He was a sumo originally, and he retired out. He did some odd jobs for about a couple of years, and the sport of professional wrestling was inching its way into Japan, and a couple of American promoters noticed the man, and they trained him. He had a few matches, and he went on excursions, mostly in the Hawaii territories at the time. Hawaii was a huge wrestling market back in the 50s and 60s, and California had a huge wrestling market, and Riki Dozan came out here to hone the craft. And he brought it back to Japan, where he became the godfather of Japanese wrestling. He is undoubtedly bigger than Hulk Hogan and even El Santo in terms of popularity in Japan and maybe worldwide view. You talk to any wrestling historian, they're going to tell you like Luthez, Hogan in terms of modern wrestling, El Santo in terms of luchador, and Riki Dozan is the reason why we have Japanese wrestling. And the reason why Japanese wrestling is unique in its own way versus what we have in America, where it's much more, a show.
Yeah, so when he was in the States, he was a heel. He was a villain character. But when he came to Japan, he played the hero. And this is a big part of why this is such a landmark for the Japanese culture. This is one of the first television broadcast nationally, where he stands up to these two guys that are actually Canadian, but to the audience they looked American. So you get this Japanese guy defeating these American guys, and it's very cathartic after World War II. So I can understand why the Japanese audience is really latched onto it. So the industry starts and it kind of evolves over the years, and it grows and grows. And then in the 80s, the Japanese economy is booming. So they can afford to bring the top talent from the US over to Japan and make them do what they want, basically.
Pretty much. They were, I mean, those, in the 80s you had All Japan Pro Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling, who were run by Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba, who were both the disciples of Ricky Dozen. So Dozen, unfortunately, was assassinated towards the end of the 60s, was it 66, if I recall. And Inoki and Baba wanted to keep his spirit alive and keep the art of pro wrestling alive, so they both went off because they each had their own terms of what style they wanted to do. And Japanese wrestling is very stiff, very hard-hitting, and it is no nonsense. There's no, at the time, no paraded characters. It is still what we call worked, like there is a predetermined outcome. But you go out there and you start throwing elbows and kicks, and you're putting in holds like you are actually having a wrestling match. And depending on which one you go with, you had King's Road, which was All Japan, which a lot of guys land on their necks and it looks terrible. Or you had Strong Style by Inoki, which was very martial arts based. And some of the stiffest matches you'll ever see are from either of these promotions. In the 80s, you had guys like Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Stan Hansen, were all massive over there, mostly because these are giants of men. They were monsters in of themselves. Vader especially was one of the biggest draws of it because these were almost like monsters and cartoon characters in their own right. And they followed along. They weren't going with the style of American, they were going with the Japanese style, which won over everybody's hearts.
Yeah, and at the same time you start to see women's wrestling take off in Japan, and it becomes its own kind of subgenre.
Joshi.
Yeah. And what I find interesting is you get some of the wrestler ladies start to like release albums at the same time. So it's this media mix where they are pop idols and wrestlers, and that just gets more exacerbated as the decades progress along. And that kind of brings us to the premise that we're going to talk about today, because in the modern age, in the 2010s, New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is a big wrestling company.
The Federation of Japan, the premier group out of the big three.
They were sold to Bushiroad, who you might know from making mobile games and card games and things like that. And basically, they turned the company around with this multimedia blitz where it starts crossing over with like, yeah, in your mobile game you can also get wrestler characters, or your card game and the anime and manga, and of course Tokusatsu.
If I might add that. So there is an event from 2015 where this was 2014, about 2014 that this was most apparent with the synergy. Bushiroad had a new card game coming out, and their top star in New Japan is a guy named Kazuchika Okada. And Okada is a fantastic wrestler, and he's very flashy. And he had possibly one of the greatest entrances, which was to promote this brand new online card game. Bushiroad had a gigantic raptor suit, like a animatronic raptor that was one of the characters. So Okada comes out with a giant buster sword that looks like Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, with this raptor, and you watch it and you're just like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. Because it's a man who commands a dinosaur and he's about to go kick some butt in the wrestling ring.
So I think we gotta take the Tokusatsu connections really back to King Kong versus Godzilla, and there's a lot to go off of here. In the first drafts, when it was still King Kong versus Frankenstein, the idea was that there was going to be an exhibition match between King Kong and the hybrid monster that would, spill out into the streets of San Francisco. As we all know, that didn't quite happen that way when the actual movie was made, but sort of as a coincidence, the movie that we got was also inspired by professional wrestling. There is a wrestling match between Great Togo and Freddie Blassie that was on television in Japan, and Blassie bit Togo on the nose. and it was so shocking that allegedly people died from watching it. They were just that upset. So it was this big media kerfuffle in Japan, and people were like, has television gone so far, and so on and so forth. This is what inspires a lot of the tone of King Kong versus Godzilla, where it's this big exhibition match, and the companies are very crassly commercializing and not thinking about the results of what they're doing.
Yeah, as much as people read into the anti-capitalism message of King, it is essentially what promoting a match is. That movie is one gigantic wrestling promotion. It's because one of the appeals of pro wrestling, those who watch it here, it's not so much what's in the ring, it's also the insane world that happens behind the curtain, if you will. The backstage politics of it are just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the actual stuff that goes on in the ring, because it is this world where money's changing hands, where people are vying for positions, and it's all over make-believe stuff, which is the insane thing of it. And King Kong versus Godzilla is the exact, like, at the time for the period, is essentially that. You have a promoter, there's one big guy, which is Kong, who's the foreigner. You have Godzilla, the monster heel of Japan, and they're going to put them together for a match that they're going to broadcast for everybody to pay to see.
So you see a lot of similarities between wrestling and Tokusatsu. One of them is that the big flashy move comes at the end, and it has a special name, and you do it once per episode. And we can kind of talk about like some of the techniques that you'll see across the whole range. So.
Well, I mean, look, pro wrestling is still based in grappling, so you do have your basic standard hold, your headlocks, your ankle locks, stuff like that. But then you get into the more like martial arts aspects of throwing punches, throwing elbows. DDTs. When you get more unique, because you have to, again, it is the art of the show. So, no one is really going to grab a guy. So when you do a DDT, you grab a guy, underhook, and the guy is you're supposed to lift your opponent up, and the guy's supposed to protect himself, and as the guy delivering the move, you have to protect your opponent. So you're not going to spike him on his head, although I have seen it happen in real life, the guy crack his head open. But it is, when you're sitting there watching, like, oh my god, how's that guy dead? And then the guy who took the move gets back up, and you're like, holy crap, these guys are superhuman. It is part of the appeal, and it's also part of the fun, because you're never going to see that in a mixed martial arts fight. And if you do, it's a freak accident. Yes, the drop kick too. A beautiful maneuver, best drop kick, two best drop kicks in the industry is Okada. Okada gets a perfect 90 degrees, and Bob Holly, also known as Hardcore Holly. He did something.
What about Source?
He's got a good one. But Bob Holly and Okada, those are the two best.
I think you need a tail to really do it
properly.
Yo.
Also, you mentioned Douglas Top. So would that make Mr. Gucci Mr. McMahon?
Yes.
I would believe it.
Yes. Embodies everything of it. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on this.
The Coco Kick.
Yeah. Which is also, if you play Fatal Fury, Fatal Fury, this is Terry Bogart's one of his main moves. But this is, Liger essentially introduced this move into the mainstream. And I've actually seen it used in a couple of UFC fights too, because it is based off a Taekwondo technique. The big chop, which is the signature of pro wrestling. In Japanese pro wrestling, it is about how tough you are. And as tough as you are, you're going to chop the hell out of your opponent. And when you get that, in America, you're going to hear like, because you're protecting the guy. In Japan, these guys are trying to legit prove they are tough. And you have guys like Kenta Kobashi, who delivers one of the stiffest chops you'll ever hear. It's like that when you hear an opponent, and not only that, but his opponent's chest immediately starts welling up. And not only that, these guys will go back and forth for 5-10 minutes just chopping the hell out of each other. And if you love pro wrestling, it is great because it gets that audience hype, because you're like, which guy is going to fall first? Because you can see the wells, but then this is not, you're like, okay, this part's not paid. Who's going to have a heart attack first because of the trauma that's being inflicted on their chests? The lariats, the clothesline. The proper term is the lariat. Who had the best lariat? That was Stan Hansen. Stan Hansen would take your head off in the ring. Stan Hansen, who was a big fat cowboy guy, he weighed like 300 pounds. He was blind, essentially blind. He had I think like 30% of his eyesight, so you can only see if you're right there. He was massive in Japan. He was a decent draw here, but in Japan they worshipped him. And this guy would come out, and he had that like a brawler style. He was not a technical guy at all. He would just go out and beat the hell out of your opponent. These guys would have huge matches, and he would take your head off because he wasn't pulling back. I've seen guys like just go over, like just completely just fold like a house of cards because his thick arm was just pretty much giving him a concussion as he was going out there putting on a show. If you want to see a match that has the best lariat, it's between Stan Hansen and Vader in Japan in 1990. And Vader got hit so hard by Stan, Vader's eye pops out of his socket.
So I think it's pretty common knowledge that Ultraman's 3-minute time limit is based on the length of a boxing round. Some wrestling companies use
early in the days.
Yeah, it's less common now.
Yeah, no, that's completely gone.
Another influence that you'll see a lot from professional wrestling is the way that some of the costumes are designed.
And this is actually very influenced from American wrestling. American wrestling, once the American guys, especially like Ric Flair and Buddy Rogers, who realized, like Buddy Rogers especially was a very flamboyant character, because in America, it's about how you draw. And there's guys who they weren't what you would call technical wizards. So to get over, you talk, you have a good talking game, like you can hype people up. That's, you work the art of the promo. Then you add some flair and flash to yourself. So you have the boas, you have the big throws, then you start getting to like, okay, what else can I do? What can I do? And that's where you get your WWF in the late 80s and early 90s, where like your Papa Shangos, your Hogans, everyone, it's the art of the gimmick, and that's what they call it. So it was only appropriate that manga started influencing Japanese wrestlers when these Japanese wrestlers would come over to like Canada and wrestle in Stampede Wrestling, and they would see the guys come from America and they're like, what are you doing there? Because in Japan at the time, you went out in trunks and you just walked on your opponent. So now you add an extra dynamic flair to it. Now you can get over even faster. That gets you up higher in the card, and that makes you more money. The jobber. So in the wrestling parlance, the jobber is the guy who is losing the match. And not only is he losing the match, he's losing the match in a spectacular fashion. Usually, so there's two versions. So the guy who's going to lose the match is going to job to the winner. Now, depending on how the match is booked, so it's laid out, you're either building a guy, so you have a guy you see potential in. So say a early Jushin Liger, so early on in his career. He's not big yet, but the promoters see potential in him, and the crowd's like, I like this guy. But he needs to get some wins. So you give them either some older guys who are on their way out, or what they're doing is they're doing their part to help put guys over, which means they are going to help build this guy. Or you have a guy that's his entire job. He goes out there, he makes his opponent look good, and he's going to lay down almost every time. There are career jobbers, and they're very good at what they do. If you guys watch wrestling, Barry Horowitz would be like the jobber if you watch wrestling back in the 90s.
Politically correct was the enhancement talent.
Enhancement talent? Yeah, we don't call that.
Tag team's another trope that you see kind of carry over.
Not only that, but it's also the funnest in the sense of kaiju, because you get more monsters for your buck. Tag team is also a different style of wrestling. You have a much more dynamic open book, because now you have 4 guys going back and forth. And tag team wrestling has widely evolved since the days where you held onto the rope at the edge of the corner and tagged in. Because now they added the dynamic of like, okay, these two guys did a big move, and the faces are trying to get to their opponents. The guy's leading out, it's like, come on, just tag me in so I can get in. And then you got the heels breaking the rules, coming in and dragging the face away. Now you get guys like in AEW, like the Bucks and the Lucha Bros, who they're like, we're not following those rules. We're just going to go out there and we're going to have a high-speed match where if someone comes out alive, that's going to be a miracle.
Yeah, you mentioned heels breaking the rules, so I figured the next slide was appropriate to skip to, because that's another thing that you see, kind of the underhanded tactics that the villain characters will use.
Which is also a very American base. Actually, I believe Lucha Libre took to this a lot more too, especially once the dynamic of the mask characters. So you have your Rudos, which are the heels, and this is all you do. You're doing this kind of stuff left and right. It's all underhanded tactics, and there will be times where you'll have heels cheat the entire match, and you get the people really upset, and it's all about working the crowd. It is working everybody, and then your hero will get his finishing move in out of nowhere, and then you get the wonderful celebration. Or if you're building a long-term feud, you have the heel completely cheat, or you have the face looks like he's going to win, and the heel will cheat, and that way you can keep this program, which is a feud between the two guys, going on. So then you can have the singles match, you can have the rematch and the face move, and now you have to have the buffer match, which will be the big match, your cage match, your gimmick match, a ladder match of some sort.
Yeah, speaking of faces and heels, they don't have to stay one or the other.
No,
so.
Very few people in terms of pro wrestling stay a face. I think Rey Mysterio is probably one of the few guys who has never, I think he turned heel briefly. Since he went to WWE, he's never been a heel. John Cena at this point, he's a career face. And that's the thing, that's what adds the dynamic, because a face turn and a heel turn only work if it's either going to be a huge surprise or people are behind it. There are guys like, okay, best example is The Rock. When The Rock came into WWF, he was Rocky Johnson. He was a combination of his dad and his grandfather's gimmick. He kept the tassels and kind of had like a weird hairdo, and he was like, you look at him like, this guy looks like a dork. And people booed him. He was a face, but people were like, we hate this guy. And that's where you got the constant booing, people chanting, die, Rocky, die, we don't like you. And that's when he embraced, like, you know what, I'd be better as a bad guy. He embraced it, became The Rock, and arguably became one of the biggest heels of all time. That's where you get your Austin Rock feud that pretty much sold out like 3 WrestleManias almost back to back.
This is one that I was really surprised that you pointed out, that there are in fact power-up transformations in wrestling.
Yes, they're very rare. They're very rare, and it's mostly Japan does this more because it is much more tied in with the Tokusatsu idea. Halfway through, and, in terms of the shows, the power-up is to sell more toys. I mean, that's the thing. But there is a storytelling element behind it where your hero will get like a boost, and sometimes it's the extra armor and it looks cool, or what they have like a berserk mode where you become almost a bad guy, but you're still a good guy. This case in point right here is Jushin Liger. So Jushin, and we're going to go into him in just a little bit more. I got a lot to say, but this is one of the few times where he introduced. Liger, I think, was the first one to really introduce this concept. A few other guys have taken it, but it's done so rarely, so when it does happen, it is a huge deal.
Most recently, I think Damien Priest from WWE actually had that into his character when he would go through a match, then all of a sudden he'd get wide-eyed and then just go on like a random.
Yeah, there's like a version of that. But there are guys in Japan. Well, actually, they'll go under the ring, they'll put makeup on, or they'll take off their mask or something. Like this is like Liger getting his entire uniform ripped off.
A couple of little fun trivia things. One of the early Kamen Rider concepts had the main character as a wrestler. Also, wrestling plays into the backstory for Rainbow Man, if anybody remembers that Tokusatsu series. Several of the Titans in Attack on Titan are based on MMA fighters and wrestlers. I think the most notable one is Brock Lesnar.
Brock Lesnar is the Armored Death. That's so. This is a little more recent thing. In the early 2000s, mixed martial arts really took off, and part of it is because of a gentleman we're going to get to in a moment named Minoru Suzuki, who created a promotion called Pancrase. And Pancrase was not, it was wrestling without being fixed. So it was actual grappling, it was strikes. You couldn't have a closed fist. But you had legitimate fights like Ken Shamrock, Josh Barnett, go out there, and pretty much they would have, if you have any of UFC's like Fight Pass, they're all on there. Early Pancrase is awesome because it's like watching pro wrestling and you don't know who's going to win because these guys are legitimately fighting it out. They're doing palm strikes. There's a guy named Bosco, Wapo, and one of the greatest kings of Pancrase out there. And they pretty much brought this style that was evolved into mixed martial arts. And in around 2002, 2004 was a boom period where Pride Fighting Championship was introduced in Japan. And Pride was mixed martial arts that introduced pro wrestling elements. They were the first ones to embrace the pageantry of pro wrestling. So every Pride event had these huge openings. They would introduce the fighters. They came down like they were almost like superheroes in of themselves. And then they would go out and have these 20-minute matches. He's not here today, but Don Frye famously had one of the greatest matches in Pride. He fought a pro wrestler by the name of Takayama. And if you've seen the clip, it's the two of them. Takayama's a giant bear of a man. And Don Frye is Don Frye. He looks like a video game character. And these two go out there and have what is essentially like a hockey fight. They lock and then they just start wailing. And these guys don't let up for about 8.5 minutes until Frye finishes off Takayama. When Takayama gets up, his face looks like it went through a meat grinder because of just how bad Frye was laying into it. But these guys were like, in terms of like when people think of fighting, this is the clip that gets shown to everybody. MMA is not exactly that anymore. It's kind of evolved, but that was the glory days.
Yeah, and if you watch Attack on Titan, you can definitely like see some of that. This is one of those things that I think is pretty amusing, is that there's a move called the Atkins kick that people say that Scott Atkins invented, but if you ask Scott Atkins about it, he says, no, it's not the Atkins kick, it's the Guyver kick. I learned it from watching the Guyver.
Has anybody here seen Guyver too?
Dark Hero.
Yes. Yep. So none of you have. Your homework assignment tonight is to go find it. It's actually $4.99 on Amazon. I think it's on Prime. In terms of like American Tokusatsu, it is the absolute, I think, pinnacle. Would you agree?
I would go with that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's real good.
For a movie that was made on $500,000, it is spectacular.
What about the first one that had Mark Hamill in it?
We don't need to talk about it.
That one's a mess. That one's a Frankenstein movie.
So I was in the dealer's room early and I saw this. It's a Luchador Ultraman, and I was just like, this is too perfect because this ties right into our discussion that there's a whole lot of wrestling characters that are based on Tokusatsu characters, especially in the Lucha community. But there's also one Ultraman, Ultraman Robin, that's an officially licensed character from Tsuburaya. And then there's a whole bunch of other different Tokusatsu that have been made into wrestling characters, or in the case of Sergeant Frog anime.
So two of those guys up there, so Riser Glenn is Tajiri Ishimori, who is one of the best junior heavyweights in the world right now. He works for New Japan Pro Wrestling. He's part of a group called Bullet Club, and he's awesome. And then next, which is Dos Caesar?
Yeah, Leo Caesar from Caesar X.
Yeah, Leo Caesar. I'm going blind. Kota Ibushi, who is arguably one of the, if not the best pro wrestler working today. And by the way, Ibushi is a gigantic nerd in of himself, and he kind of embraces this lunacy of kind of gimmicking up. Because for a lot of wrestlers, when they come in, if you're good but you're kind of bland as a character, the promoter will usually give you a character, which someone will go into in a minute. A lot of guys see that as a death sentence for their career, while other guys embrace it, which we're going to get into.
Yeah, so speaking of characters, I think the most famous has to be Tiger Mask, which this is a manga that started in the 1960s from the creator of Ashita no Joe, and it's an absolute classic in Japan. Basically, the premise of Tiger Mask is that there's this heel wrestler in America that comes back to Japan and sees some orphans that are like, we like to watch you fight. And then he says, I can't be evil anymore. And then his company says, no, we're going to send our evil guys after you because you're not evil anymore. So this is a huge hit, and it got an anime that ran for 105 episodes. And it kind of plays around with, while wrestling is real, legit stakes in the world of Tiger Mask, it brings in a lot of characters from actual wrestling companies. So, Andre the Giant, Abdullah the Butcher, these guys make appearances in the show itself, and it's such a classic that like there's Tiger Mask charities in Japan where they give to real life orphanages, and it's really cool. But one of the main real life impacts of this is, of course, New Japan Pro Wrestling licensed the character in 1982 and decided to have the character show up in wrestling matches. And the guy that they got to play him was a really good wrestler.
Yes, he's a fantastic junior. So in Japan, unlike here, they separate by weight. So there's the junior heavyweight, which I believe is 220 below, and then heavyweights, which is 220 above. Now, they play around with it, but they do take the weight class seriously. Usually, light heavyweights will only wrestle light heavyweights in one-on-one matches. If there's a tag team match, then that's where you can kind of mix and match, and heavyweights stay with heavyweights. Tiger Mask was, and then junior heavyweights, or the junior heavyweights in Japan were starting to build. Like they weren't taken as seriously as the heavyweights at the time. But when Tiger Mask came around, it brought it shined a whole new light on the division. Because Sayama was a fantastic wrestler. He's considered by Bret Hart to be one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. And if Bret Hart saying that means a lot. If you know your wrestling parlances. Tiger Mask became a massive hit with New Japan. It was the first time that instead of creating a character, they just licensed it. It was supposed to be like a very limited thing that took on a life of itself. Then the rights were snagged from under New Japan's grasp by rival All Japan, and they put the mask on Mitsuharu Misawa, who, depending on who you talk to, is probably, in modern terms, probably some people consider the best wrestler of all time. Again, it depends who you talk to. Misawa was the guy in Japan, along with Kenta Kobashi in the mid-90s. And he was under the mask, and he said, I'm done with this. Once he took off the mask, actually, it was the one time where he was big as Tiger Mask, and he got even bigger once he took the mask off. And he became this indestructible wrestling machine. And he was one of the few guys having 60, 70-minute matches with guys, and it was bell to bell, just slaughterhouse-like rules where these guys are just beating the house out of each other. One of the best matches I would recommend is Misawa and Kenta Kobashi from the promotion that they created called Noah in, I think it was like 94, 95, which has a moment that, as a young man watching wrestling for the first time, I'd never seen before, where two guys took a suplex from the top of the ring onto the mat below, which no one in their right mind outside of like catch guys were doing at the time. And you sat there and watched them like, again, someone's going to die. Like, I'm going to watch murder in the ring.
So you have all of these guys that play Tiger Mask, and then you get more guys that play other Tiger things, because this just becomes a huge motif.
Well, Black Tiger became Tiger Mask's main rival, and Black Tiger is traditionally played by a Gaijin wrestler, which is a foreigner. The two most famous ones would be Tiger Mask 2, which was Eddie Guerrero, when he was in excursion to Japan, and then I want to say TJ Perkins played a later version. Black Tiger isn't really around right now because Tiger Mask is kind of like lower on the totem pole until I think they find that the current performer is kind of like wrapping up his career. So it depends on what they're going to do with the character going forward. While still popular, the wrestling side of it is kind of waned a little bit. So until maybe New Japan figures out what they want to do with it, like he's kind of like in the background right now, unfortunately.
So, of course, because we're talking about Tokusatsu, we have to bring up that there have been multiple Tiger Mask movies. In fact, across 3 different countries there have been. So you have the first one is actually an American-made movie. It feels very like made for television. Then you have the movie in Japan in 2004, which is really kind of about like Sho Aikawa on an investigative journey trying to find the identity of Tiger Mask. You have the 2013 one, which is more of like a superhero thing, and there's one from just last year in South Korea. I haven't had a chance to check that one out yet. There's also an anime series that just came out in 2016, and this is part of that mixed media thing where Bushiroad's really cross-promoting. And one of the things that is fun about this is it's got all of the major talents coming in and voicing themselves. And even though in live action, in reality, Tiger Mask Double is played by Kota Ibushi, he has a fight with him in the anime because he can do that.
Yeah. So yeah, Ibushi wrestled, I think it's that Tiger Mask W, I think only about 4 or 5 times. Most famously, I think he wrestled Okada on the New Japan was an anniversary show every March. I believe that was the main time that they brought him out. And by the way, his mask was very much not a normal luchador mask. It's a prefab, almost like helmet that he was wearing. And unfortunately, Bushi, who can pretty much work in anything, this poor guy was struggling. Like at one point, the mask kind of turns to the side when he takes a bump, and he's like sitting there, like kind of just jerking around with this thing, and it became such a disaster. I believe that's what ended the push with that version of the character, and they just let Bushi go back to being a Bushi.
So yeah, you'll see lots of tiger-themed characters in wrestling, and that's kind of where it came from. Also of note is that the wrestling company in Tiger Mask, Toru no Ana, the Tiger Cave, is the name of a major doujinshi shop in Japan that is sadly closing down right now. But if you're ever in Akihabara, that's kind of one of the staples there. So along those lines, characters that get licensed out, you get this anime from Go Nagai in 1989, and they decide, hey, we should have a wrestler as a tie-in for it, and then we're off to the races.
So this is where these two things really intersect. So Tiger Mask was insanely popular for New Japan, and when All Japan had wrestled away the rights, they're like, well, let's do it again. They actually went to Go to create, like, the show was not created just as a normal thing. They went to Go and got, can you create something that we can use as a wrestler? So he said, sure. The Jushin Liger anime is nothing of what was built up from the wrestler. It's actually kind of a cool, like, biomechanical mech show. It has an awesome theme that became Jushin Liger's theme. But Jushin Liger was a young lion. So in New Japan, they actually they have their own dojo, they train their own guys, and then they send them on excursions. So they're like, okay, you're good, you got the fundamentals. We're sending you to Canada so you can pick up other styles. We're sending you to the US, you're going to Mexico so you can hone your style. So you have Kichi Yamada, who at the time when he was wrestling, pretty solid guy. He goes to Mexico, learns Lucha Libre style, and then he goes to Calgary to wrestle with the Hart family, and develops what becomes the definition of the light heavyweight style. And he comes back, and Japan's like, hey, we got this gimmick for you. So the bottom is the original gimmick. So that is Jushin Liger when he first started, based on Liger's first look in the show. And then, much like everything, there's the upgrade, which becomes Jushin Thunder Liger. And here's the thing with Yamada. Yamada embraced the character. Not only did he embrace it, he went full hog with it and actually made it his own.
So he made taping his lifestyle.
Very much so. And he became exceptionally popular to the point where there was one time out, but you want to take it off? I was like, no, I'm Liger, Liger is me. Like, we are one and the same. And here's the thing, unlike Mexico, where wrestlers' identities are kept secret by law, it is a law down there. Like, if you're under a mask until the mask is removed, your identity remains secret. In Japan, everyone kind of knows who's who, but Yamada pretty much went out there and started stunning people with his matches. He was the first guy going to like the top rope. He was having matches where where you see modern wrestling, where you see these smaller guys who are kind of bouncing off the ropes, doing flips, doing head scissors. This is all the stuff that he was learning when he was like wrestling Owen Hart in Calgary, and that put the character over the limit. Like he became a superhero in his own right in Japan. Like he took almost what America was doing, added the Japanese flavor to it, and became a freaking legend. And not only that, he's one of my favorite pro wrestlers of all time because you can watch any Liger match, and as long as mostly in Japan, but when he came to America for excursions or in Mexico, my God, he was having gangbuster matches, and became the most prolific light heavyweight wrestler of all time. He held the New Japan light heavyweight title 11 times. 2 of those reigns were, I think, 400 to 500 days, about almost 2 years. And he's wrestled everybody and their brother that you can think of.
Yeah, and gotten his own Tokusatsu movie with the special effects from Steve Wang, who we just mentioned Guyver earlier. So.
Which is kind of cool. It's sad it's never got an official release over here. It's very hard. So yeah, so this is the move that he essentially invented on his, he took inspiration from.
He was reading Fist of the North Star and said, I could do that, and then he did. So if it sounds like he's a huge nerd, that's because he's a huge nerd.
Biggest Godzilla fan. So, back in the early 2000s, I was doing a documentary on independent wrestling in Southern California, and there was a couple of guys out there who worked with Liger when they went to Japan. And Liger is one of those guys. He's like, come over to my house. Like we'll hang out, we'll have fun, we'll drink some beers. And who the heck was I talking to? I'm a little drunk. It's been 20 years at this point. But I was wearing a Godzilla shirt, and the dude looked at me and was like, "You're as big as Godzilla fan?" I'm like, "Who?" He's like, "Liger." And he's like, "Hold on a second." Went to his bag and got a picture of him at Liger's house. And Liger, so this was like maybe a year before. So we're talking like 2001, 2002. Liger had every like Kyoto and Billiken Godzilla kit. He built them all himself. He painted them, and he's like, he has one room that is floor to ceiling Godzilla. He's like, you'll never meet a bigger Godzilla fan in your life. This man eats and breathes Godzilla. So when I got the opportunity to finally meet Liger back in 2017, he was at a lucha show out in California. I rolled up only like one of 3 guys that speaks English in the entire place because it was a lucha show. And I get in line, I walk up to my last guy, he looks at me and he's like, "Whoa, Godzilla?" I'm like, "Yes, Godzilla." He's like, "Oh, Godzilla number 1. I'm like, yes. He's like, Ichiban number 1. No other monster. I'm like, "What about Gamera?" He's like,
cool, but not Godzilla.
"Yes." And he goes to me and he's like, "Favorite?" Like, "Anguillus." He's like, "Yes, whoa, Anguillus." That's what. Because he speaks some English, so he was, trying, and you could tell it's like he wanted to talk about Godzilla, but they're like, "Hey, bell time's in like 2 minutes." He's like, "Godzilla, number one, Godzilla."
We need to see Liger fight Godzilla sometime.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, he had a wrestling match against Godzilla. He lost.
Yeah, this was 2019. This was Liger announced his retirement at the end of beginning of 2019. He was going for a whole year, and he would end his last match at the Tokyo Dome in 2020. So Liger was front and center for a lot of things, and this is the time when this is when we had King of the Monsters coming out over here, and this was during the promotion for it in Japan that they decided to do this. So they have I think that's the suit that was used in the
Boss Coffee.
Yes, the Boss Coffee commercial. And if you watch it, this is like a whole 25-minute video.
Yeah.
So Liger was the guy in Japan because he was older. He would be doing like all the behind-the-scenes stuff. Like there's a great video of him going around and like trying to pin dudes while they're sleeping in the dojo. But this, he came out like you could almost see like the tears coming out of his mask. And so they do this whole thing in the ring where he is selling for Godzilla. It is the greatest. It's like watching like a 5-year-old have his dream match. If you get a chance, go look it up tonight.
Yeah, we've got like 5 minutes or something, so we should power through. Aztec Kaiser is a really cool wrestling show from Tsuburaya Productions. It's a combination of animation and live action. If you remember, like Eisenborg, it's doing a similar thing to that. You can see a lot of neat things in there, including reused Ultraman vehicles, and the guy that's definitely not Spider-Man, I promise. Kinnikuman is a huge wrestling character property in Japan. It's kind of the basis on which all of the like modern shonen action series come from. This started off as an Ultraman parody. It's about a guy from the planet Muscle that comes and fights kaiju, and eventually it becomes more and more wrestling related. And it's had multiple spin-offs over time. A lot of people might remember the muscle figures, which stands for millions of unseen creatures lurking everywhere, which is similar to the Keshi that you get in a lot of kaiju collectibles. His signature move is this muscle buster, which Samoa Joe was a fan of the anime and said I could do that, and then he did.
It's a monster when he does it too.
Yeah, it's illegal now because reasons. Some people might remember the Kinnikuman II anime that was on Fox Kids. This is one of those ones that was popular enough that it actually got more episodes made for the U.S. market after it was done in Japan. This aired alongside Ultraman Tiga also. So there is of course, real wrestlers that take on the persona of Kinnikuman. Fire Leon is a more modern character that you get a lot of crossovers with different wrestling characters in Tokusatsu with. This brings us to Kaiju Pro Wres, which is this Japanese pro wrestling troupe since 2019, where they set up kind of buildings and have monsters. And I think it's really cool that something like this exists in Japan, but actually the US did it first. Since 1994, we've had Kaiju Big Battel, which is
it's exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah.
It's big suits, and actually Kota Ibushi actually feuded with these guys for a whole year because he had always wanted to work with them, and he finally got his match. It was like 2018, 2019. He went out there and had a spectacular match with the dude in a foam rubber suit.
Yeah, it was actually a brilliant cross promotion that he finally got to do that then, because he had this movie coming out, Kaiju Mono, which is a Minoru Kawasaki film. Which is kind of like a parody of Captain America: The First Avenger, where you have this dweeby guy that takes a drug and turns into Kota Ibushi, and then he takes more drug and he turns into Minoru Suzuki.
Minoru Suzuki because it's the evil gene.
Minoru Kawasaki actually has a lot of history with kaiju wrestling. So his kind of his first theatrical feature was something called the Ika Wrestler, or the Calamari Wrestler, which is actually kind of a very heartfelt movie about a professional wrestler who is a squid.
Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic film. It's legitimately good. It looks goofy, but it was shot.
Oh, it's
available here in the U.S. on DVD from Discotheque.
Yes, it is.
A cross between the Muppets and Godzilla.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Seems very promising.
The Calamari Wrestler costume actually stuck around for a while. The recent movie Monster Sea Wars, actually, in the concept art, you can see that the squid costume looks very much like that one. So I think the plan was to reuse that one, and they went with a different costume at the end of the day for whatever reason. There was also Kabuto-Oh Beetle. This one is not available, or is it on?
It's on Prime. It's on Prime somewhere.
This is a Go Nagai creation, also directed by Kawasaki. Along the lines of these cheap direct-to-video tokusatsu movies, you have Mega Ladies, which is directed by Koichi Ohara, the crazy person behind MD Geist and Genocyber, and actually has a lot of good talent working on it, including the Godzilla 2000 designer Hideo Okamoto and Fuyuki Shinada doing the suits, and it's these a pair of wrestling ladies that have to wrestle against space aliens. Koichi Ohara also did a manga once where El Santo fights Zarkor the Invader and Crawl the Sea Monster. Recently we've had an American movie called Rumble that's all about kaiju wrestling. It's not very good, so yeah, it's strange. It's based on a book, but the book actually is not about wrestling at all. So. And that kind of brings us to our last leg. We can maybe blow through some of these pretty quickly because we're running very short on time. But you get a lot of actors that show up in both wrestling and tokusatsu. We have to, of course, acknowledge Little Man Machan, who was inside the Minila suit. Dwarf wrestling is like a whole thing into itself. Yeah. Don Frye, who is not here at the convention, but
actually, there's Antonio Inoki's last opponent too.
Mach Fumiaki, who you might remember from Gamera Super Monster or Nezerla 1964, she was really one of those ones that really brought the whole idol cross promotion thing where you would sing and be a wrestler at the same time. She was a trailblazer, yeah. Hiroshi Tanahashi is a huge Kamen Rider nerd. His signature pose is the pose he got from Kamen Rider Kabuto, and he just made that his gimmick. His gimmick is that he is a nerd, and as a result, he got to be in the Kamen Rider XXVIII movie.
It's intense. Like he has the eye of the tiger when he's doing it.
And he got to be Garo once, so. Not to be confused with Hiromu Takahashi. So Hiroshi Tanahashi to Hiromu Takahashi, they're both in Kamen Rider. Togi Makabe, another heel guy, Makabe, was also in Garo.
Hiroki Goto, the perpetual Nick Carter guy. Yeah. All these guys, again, they're all gigantic nerds.
Yeah.
All super nerds. And this is, for Americans, it would be like you're, showing up in a Marvel movie. For them, this is that version for them.
Reika Saiki, you didn't seem like you were terribly familiar with her.
Joshi there's certain stuff that I'm missing on. So.
She's ripped, though.
Yes.
Yeah. She plays a character called the Fighting Fairy in Kamen Rider Build. Several of the Grongi in Kamen Rider Kuuga, which is getting a US release soon, so look out for them. This guy, I don't really know too much about. He was in Kamen Rider and in Mr. Maxman. Minoru Suzuki.
Minoru Suzuki, real quick, we can just talk about this man for a quick. This is the man who was the godfather of mixed martial arts in Japan. He's the one who created Concrates. He is a murder machine, and he's also the biggest nerd on the face of the planet. To the point he loves Ultraman, and he fell in love with One Piece so much that who's the creator of One Piece?
Ichiro Oda.
Ichiro put him in there as a legitimate. He is a character in One Piece now. Like he has his own One Piece merchandise. He's in there as I believe he is Minoru Suzuki in the actual show. I think he wrestles with Chopper.
He's fighting Usopp right there.
Okay,
you can see.
yeah.
So yeah, he's you can get a figure of him.
He's murder grandpa in the wrestling scene.
Cutie Suzuki, another person that was all over anime and tokusatsu. I guess she had a sort of briefer wrestling career, is what you said.
Had a cup of coffee in it.
Shinya Hashimoto.
Considered one of the greatest of all times.
Yeah, I remember him from Kamen Rider, from Ultraman Gaia. Sorry, my brain is not good. Tatsumi Fujinami. Yeah, he's in the Men That Made Ultraman, playing Akiji Kobayashi's character. And Bob Sapp is one of those guys that you'll see all over in Japan. I've seen Bob Sapp Dojinshi. He's that popular. And as a Tokusatsu fan, I'm like, haha, you were the three-headed guy in Devilman. That's hilarious.
Pretty much, yeah. Like he also had one of the best martial arts fights I've ever watched with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira from Pride, where he got dropped on his head by a guy half his size, and these two just went on to have like a slaughterhouse fight. It's a legitimate fight too. It looks like two anime characters doing it. It legitimately looks like something from Fist of the North Star. So
on that note, I think we are supposed to be clearing out of here within the next minute or so. So thanks everybody for coming.